The following story is a dramatization inspired by real-life themes of police corruption and FBI sting operations. The specific characters, names, and sequence of events have been constructed for narrative purposes, as a verifiable case matching all details of this story could not be independently confirmed. It is intended to illustrate a powerful story of courage and justice. What happens when a man sworn to protect and serve becomes a predator? When the badge that's meant to be a symbol of safety becomes a tool of terror? And what happens when his victim, a 72-year-old grandfather who has lived his entire life by the rules, decides he's not going down without a fight? In a quiet town, where people still believed in the goodness of their neighbors, a simple traffic stop on a sunny afternoon turned into a brutal roadside robbery. This wasn't the work of some random thug or a desperate criminal. The perpetrator was a police officer in full uniform, a man who had taken an oath to uphold the law, but instead, twisted it into a weapon for his own personal gain. When the victim tried to seek justice, the system that was supposed to help him slammed the door in his face, protecting its own and leaving him isolated and afraid. But his story didn't end there. When local law enforcement became part of the problem, the FBI had to get creative. In a high-stakes gambit, they decided to turn the victim into the bait, setting an elaborate trap to catch a monster hiding behind a badge. This is the story of how one man's quiet courage helped expose the deep-seated sickness that had taken root in his town, and how he risked everything to reclaim his dignity. Walter Mason was a man who believed in the simple virtues of an honest life. At 72, he was a retired mechanic, his hands still bearing the faint, ingrained lines of grease and oil from a lifetime of fixing other people's problems. He was a widower, having lost his beloved wife, Clara, 5 years prior, and a doting grandfather who lived his life by a simple, unshakable code: be good to others, work hard, and trust the system. That trust was the bedrock of his world. But it was about to be shattered on a Tuesday afternoon, just a few miles from the safety of his own home. The flashing red and blue lights exploded in his rearview mirror, a sudden, jarring intrusion on a peaceful day. Walter's heart gave a familiar lurch. He pulled his trusted, 20-year-old sedan to the shoulder, his hands instinctively gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, just like he was taught in driver's ed 60 years ago. He ran through a mental checklist. He wasn't speeding, his registration was current, and he'd signaled his last turn. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but you still feel that knot tighten in your stomach when a police cruiser is behind you. The officer who ambled up to his window was a mountain of a man, his frame so large it blocked out the afternoon sun. He had a permanent scowl etched onto his face, and his presence felt less like a public servant and more like an occupying force. The name tag on his chest read, Reed. Officer Reed's questions were hostile from the very first word. He spoke of a supposed traffic violation, something about an improper lane change, a claim Walter knew was entirely imaginary. But it was the cop's eyes that truly set off the alarms in Walter's mind. They weren't the eyes of someone there to help or to serve. They were cold, calculating, and predatory. They scanned the car, not for safety issues, but for opportunities. Things escalated with terrifying speed. "Step out of the vehicle," Reed commanded, his voice dripping with a contempt that had nothing to do with any traffic law. Walter, confused and increasingly frightened, complied. Reed was hunting, and Walter was his prey. Without another word, Reed shoved the 72-year-old man against the side of his own car. The sudden force knocked the wind out of him. Before Walter could process what was happening, Reed was rifling through his pockets, then snatching his wallet from the car's console. He found what he was looking for, the $300 in cash Walter had just withdrawn from the bank. It was for his grandson's 8th birthday present, a new bicycle he'd been dreaming of for months. Reed expertly palmed a $100 bill, pocketing it with a fluid motion that suggested years of practice. "Consider this a roadside fine," he sneered, the words a grotesque parody of his duty. But the humiliation wasn't over. Reed then wrenched Walter's thin arms behind his back and slapped on a pair of handcuffs. He tightened them with a cruel, deliberate satisfaction, ignoring Walter's gasp of pain as the cold steel bit into his wrist. He cinched them so tight that the metal edges broke Walter's fragile skin, leaving him standing there, humiliated, his own blood dripping onto the hot asphalt. This wasn't just an abuse of power, it was a terrifyingly polished routine. Walter would later learn that Officer Reed had a dark reputation for targeting and robbing elderly black and minority residents, people he assumed were too scared or too powerless to fight back. For 10 long, agonizing minutes, Walter stood handcuffed and bleeding in the sun while Reed sat comfortably in his air-conditioned cruiser, calmly writing a bogus ticket. The physical pain in his wrist was sharp, but the psychological wound was infinitely deeper. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a profound violation of his dignity, an act that stripped him of his personhood. When Reed finally sauntered back, he unlocked the cuffs, tossed the wallet back into the car, and drove off without another word, leaving Walter shaken, bleeding, and his lifelong faith in the badge completely and utterly destroyed. The next morning, his wrist crudely bandaged and still throbbing, Walter Mason did what any good citizen would do. He drove to the local police station to file a complaint. He walked through the doors clutching the bogus ticket, hoping, praying, that Officer Reed was just one bad apple and that the system itself would move quickly to deal with him. He calmly and respectfully explained to the desk sergeant exactly what had happened: the fabricated traffic stop, the stolen birthday money, the unnecessary and brutal way Reed had handcuffed him, showing the man his injured wrist as proof. The response he received was his first lesson in how the system truly works. The desk sergeant listened with a profoundly bored expression, his eyes glazed over as if Walter were describing a lost cat. He slid a thick stack of forms across the counter, a bureaucratic brick wall designed to exhaust and deter. Then Walter said the name: Officer Reed. The sergeant's entire demeanor changed in an instant. He stiffened, his bored expression replaced by a defensive glare. He mumbled something about Reed being a good, by-the-book officer, and then had the audacity to suggest that maybe Walter's memory of the event was confused, due to his age. It was a veiled threat, a clear and chilling message: drop it. It was the classic runaround, but worse. It was an act of institutional complicity. The message was loud and clear: we protect our own. Walter left the station that day feeling a cold, sinking helplessness he had never known. The very people he trusted to uphold the law were actively protecting the man who broke it. He was a 72-year-old widower, all alone, trying to fight a system that was designed to protect itself at all costs. In the weeks that followed, his complaint vanished into a black hole. His follow-up phone calls went unreturned. He left messages that were never answered. He even went back once more, only to be told the internal investigation was ongoing and he wasn't to contact them again. It was as if the brutal roadside robbery had never even happened. The corruption wasn't just one bad cop, it was a fortress, a wall of silence built to make victims like Walter feel powerless and invisible, to make them just give up and go away. But Walter's story didn't just disappear. It became another pained whisper in the community, another tale of injustice traded in hushed tones at church gatherings and family dinners. It was one more story in a town where people, especially minority residents, had grown to fear the sight of a police cruiser rather than feel protected by it. And eventually, those whispers reached the right ears. Walter's complaint, along with a handful of others that had been reluctantly filed and subsequently buried, formed a disturbing pattern. All of them named Officer Reed. All of them involved suspicious traffic stops. And all of the victims were elderly, minority residents. This pattern was flagged by a diligent clerk and, through a quiet back channel, sent to the regional FBI field office. To the FBI, this was more than just a case of a single dirty cop shaking people down for cash. It was a symptom of a deeper, more virulent sickness the Bureau had been monitoring for years: the infiltration of American law enforcement by white supremacist and far-right militant ideology. A recent, confidential FBI intelligence assessment had explicitly warned that these extremists, acting as lone wolves or in organized cliques within departments, could lead to horrific abuses of power, systemic civil rights violations, and the erosion of public trust. Officer Reed's actions, his specific targeting of minorities, his excessive force, his sense of impunity, fit a disturbing and dangerous profile. The FBI didn't just see a thief, they saw a predator who was systematically violating the civil rights of the very citizens he was sworn to protect, destroying what little trust remained between the community and the police. One afternoon, 2 federal agents appeared at Walter's modest, tidy house. They didn't look like Hollywood commandos. They looked more like accountants, dressed in unassuming suits. Their names were Agent Miller and Agent Chin. They sat in his living room, a world away from the cold indifference of the police station, and they simply listened. They let Walter tell his story from beginning to end, without interrupting, without questioning his memory, without a hint of skepticism. Their gazes were steady and empathetic. For the first time since the ordeal began, Walter felt like someone actually saw him, heard him, and believed him. The agents told him they had received other reports, other whispers that painted a grim picture of Officer Reed. They told Walter they believed he was running his own personal extortion racket under the cover of his badge. "But we have a problem, Mr. Mason," Agent Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. "We have a lot of smoke, but we need the fire. We have stories, but we need irrefutable proof. To a judge and jury, it's still his word against a handful of people he's already discredited. We need to catch him in the act." That's when they laid out their proposal, a request so unbelievable, so dangerous, it seemed to suck all the air right out of the room. They wanted Walter Mason, the 72-year-old victim, the man who was still having nightmares about the incident, to become their secret weapon. They wanted him to be the bait in a sting operation to catch Officer Reed red-handed. Walter was utterly stunned. His mind reeled. They wanted him to willingly get back in a car, to face the very man who had robbed and brutalized him, the man whose cold eyes were seared into his memory. The fear was instant and overwhelming, a cold knot tightening deep in his gut. He was an old man. He had a heart condition. He wasn't a spy or a police officer. He was a grandfather who just wanted to live out his remaining years in peace. His first, screaming instinct was to say no. It was too much to ask of anyone, let alone a man his age who had already been through so much. But as he sat there in his worn armchair, the agent's words hanging in the air, his mind began to race. He thought of his neighbors, good people who now crossed the street when they saw a patrol car. He thought of his friends at the community center, who had told him their own quiet stories of being harassed and disrespected for years. He thought of his grandson and the kind of world he was growing up in, a world where a police officer could be the monster you should fear. And then, he thought of his late wife, Clara. She had been a fighter, a woman of immense principle. He could almost hear her voice, as clear as day, telling him what she always did when faced with injustice. Silence helps the oppressor, Walter. It never, ever helps the victim. He looked at the two patient agents sitting on his couch. He saw not a demand but a chance. A chance to finally fight back. A chance to ensure no one else's grandfather had to endure what he did. A chance to turn his fear into a weapon for justice. Taking a slow, deep breath that carried all his fear, all his pain, and all his newfound resolve, he looked Agent Chen directly in the eye and said two words that would change everything. "I'll do it." The moment Walter agreed, the FBI moved with incredible speed, turning his quiet, orderly life completely upside down. His home became a temporary command post. The team, led by the sharp and meticulous Agent Chen, spent the next several days coaching him, preparing him for the most dangerous role of his life. They ran through every possible scenario, every way the conversation with Reed could go. They taught him how to steer the dialogue without sounding scripted, how to feign fear while remaining in control. Most importantly, they familiarized him with the surveillance equipment he would be wearing. The audio recorder was a marvel of miniaturization, no bigger than a shirt button, expertly sewn into the seam of his favorite old jacket. The most critical piece of evidence would come from a tiny, pinhole camera concealed in a new pair of glasses the FBI had provided. Walter practiced wearing them, getting used to the feel, learning to turn his head naturally to capture everything. The plan was elegant in its simplicity, but incredibly risky. Walter would call the police department's non-emergency line to inquire about the bogus ticket he'd received. His objective was to get Officer Reed on the phone. From there, he was to play the part of a scared, confused old man, hinting that he was willing to pay a little extra. Fine. Just to make the whole problem go away. The goal was to dangle the bait, appealing directly to Reed's established pattern of greed. The risks were monumental. If Reed became even slightly suspicious, if Walter's voice shook at the wrong moment, if a piece of the delicate electronic gear failed, the operation could collapse, and Walter's safety could be compromised. Agent Chen was brutally direct about it. "Walter, if he gets even a hint that you're wired, we can't guarantee your safety. Our surveillance team will be close, but things can go very wrong in a matter of seconds. You can back out at any time." The night before the scheduled phone call, Walter barely slept. He lay in bed, the silence of the house amplifying his pounding heart. He rehearsed his lines over and over in his head, his wife's words echoing in his mind. The next morning, with Agent Chen and her team listening intently from a nondescript surveillance van parked down the street, he sat at his kitchen table and dialed the number. His hand trembled as he held the receiver. When Reed's gruff, impatient voice finally came on the line, a wave of adrenaline washed over Walter. But when he spoke, his own voice was surprisingly steady. He played the part of a scared, pliable old man to perfection, complaining about the ticket and hinting that another fine could make it all disappear. Reed, smelling easy money, didn't hesitate. He took the bait. He growled at Walter to stop calling the station but agreed to meet him in a secluded, rarely used parking lot behind a defunct strip mall the next day. The trap was set. The drive to the meeting was the longest and most silent of Walter Mason's life. The hidden wire sewn into his jacket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Every car that passed felt like a threat. Agent Chen's calm, reassuring voice in his hidden earpiece was a lifeline, a constant reminder that he was not alone. "You're doing great, Walter. Just stick to the plan. We see you, and we're right here with you." He pulled his old sedan into the desolate, cracked asphalt parking lot. Weeds grew through the fissures in the pavement, and the abandoned storefronts stared back with vacant, boarded-up eyes. As planned, he parked and waited. A few minutes later, Reed's patrol car rolled in, positioning itself deliberately to block the only exit. The officer swaggered over to Walter's car, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered gun. He was radiating an aura of absolute confidence, certain he was in total control. Reed leaned down, his face filling the driver's side window. "You got something for me, old man?" His voice was a low, menacing growl, filled with arrogance. Walter's hands trembled as he reached for the plain white envelope on the passenger seat. Inside were $200 in marked bills, meticulously prepared by the FBI. "I just want this to be over," Walter said, his voice quivering with just the right amount of genuine fear. "I'm too old for this. I don't want any more trouble." Reed snatched the envelope from his hand, his eyes glinting with triumph. "Smart man," he sneered, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "This is how things work around here. You learn your place, and we all get along just fine." He started to turn away, the stolen money clutched in his hand. In that moment, he wasn't a police officer. He was just a common thief, caught in the act. And his every word, every sneer, every move, was being broadcast live to the FBI team positioned just a few hundred yards away, their cameras zooming in, their recorders capturing every damning syllable. It was everything they needed, and more. Before Officer Reed could even take 2 steps back toward his cruiser, the quiet, abandoned lot exploded into a symphony of controlled chaos. The screeching of tires on asphalt shattered the silence as 3 unmarked FBI vehicles swarmed in from hidden positions, boxing him in completely. Doors flew open and agents in full tactical gear leaped out, their weapons drawn and aimed squarely at the corrupt cop. "FBI! Hands in the air! Get on the ground, now!" The look on Reed's face was a stunning picture of disbelief. The arrogant swagger instantly evaporated, replaced by pure, slack-jawed shock, which quickly melted into raw terror. He was a bully who had just run into a much bigger one, and his brain couldn't comprehend it. The pathetic whimpering that escaped his lips was a stark contrast to the menacing growl he had used just seconds before. He dropped the envelope of marked bills as if it were on fire. Within seconds, agents were on him, forcing him face down onto the same dirty pavement where he'd held so many of his victims captive. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the lot. It was the same sound Walter had heard, but this time, the cold steel was being locked tight behind Reed's own back. For Walter, sitting in his car just feet away, watching the entire scene unfold through his windshield, that sound was the sweetest music he had ever heard. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of his dignity being restored. As 2 agents hoisted the disgraced, whimpering cop to his feet and led him away, Agent Chin walked over to Walter's car. She opened the door, her face etched not with triumph, but with profound respect. "You did it, Walter," she said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "You did it." A single tear, one of relief and vindication, rolled down Walter's cheek. The extraordinary courage of one ordinary man helped bring down a corrupt officer that an entire system was designed to protect. Walter Mason's story is a powerful reminder that the fight for what's right often depends on everyday people refusing to be silenced. These stories of quiet heroism are happening all around us, but they often go untold. If you believe more of these stories need to be brought into the light, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, so you never miss an update in the ongoing fight for justice. The federal case against Officer Reed was swift and decisive. The high-quality audio and video Walter had bravely gathered was undeniable, ironclad proof of his crimes. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of his own words and actions, Reed's wall of defiant arrogance crumbled completely. He was convicted on multiple federal counts, including extortion under color of official right and violation of civil rights. He was sentenced to a long term in federal prison, trading his police uniform for a prison jumpsuit. The arrest sent shockwaves through the local police department and the entire town. The FBI's sting operation triggered a wider federal investigation into the department's practices, which uncovered a culture of complacency and corruption. The probe led to sweeping, court-mandated reforms, the firing of the desk sergeant who had dismissed Walter, and the forced retirement of several other officers who had enabled or ignored Reed's reign of terror for years. The wall of silence had not just been cracked, it had been shattered. But the real story here isn't just about a corrupt cop finally getting caught. It's about the rise of an unlikely and unassuming hero. Walter Mason, a 72-year-old grandfather, was targeted because a predator saw him as weak, invisible, and powerless. But in the face of that darkness, Walter found a reservoir of strength he never knew he had. He stared down his tormentor, and in doing so, became a quiet, unbreakable symbol of courage. He proved that it's never too late to stand up to injustice, and that sometimes, the most powerful weapon against evil is simply a good person who refuses to stay silent.